The hangar erupted the moment Victoria Hale stepped out of her black sedan. A $38 million charter was grounded. The pilot was gone, and no one could give her a straight answer. She turned her fury on the quietest man in the room, Liam Carter, a mechanic with oil-stained coveralls and a wrench still in his hand. "You've been crawling under this jet for 6 years," she said, loud enough for the entire crew to hear. "So fly it. Fly this jet, then we'll talk." The laughter died when Liam said, "Yes." Liam Carter arrived at the hangar 40 minutes before anyone else, the way he had every morning for the past 6 years. The private airstrip sat on the edge of the desert outside Las Vegas, far from the commercial terminals and the noise. At 5:15 in the morning, the only sound was the wind, dragging sand across the tarmac. He flipped on the overhead lights one row at a time and stood beneath the Gulfstream G700 like a man visiting something sacred. He ran his hand along the belly of the fuselage, feeling for imperfections, the way a doctor checks a pulse slowly, deliberately, with the kind of attention that comes from years of knowing what wrong feels like before it becomes visible. His phone buzzed in the chest pocket of his coveralls. A text from his daughter Sophie, 12 years old, and already better at mornings than he was. "Don't forget, parent-teacher thing at 4. He typed back a thumbs up, then slid the phone away and returned to the landing gear assembly. That was the deal. She kept him honest about the world outside this hangar, and he kept the rent paid and dinner on the table. It was a small life. He had chosen it on purpose. By 6:30, the rest of the ground crew started filtering in. Ray Dawson, the shift lead, was the first through the side door, coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He was a stocky man in his 50s, with a voice that carried across concrete, and he had known Liam longer than anyone on the team. Not well. Liam didn't allow that, but long enough to understand that the quiet wasn't emptiness. It was a wall. Ray nodded at him. Liam nodded back. That was their language, and it had worked fine for 6 years. The charter was scheduled for 8:45, a round trip to New York carrying a group of investors tied to a deal Victoria Hale had been building for the better part of a year. The numbers were significant, $38 million on the table, with penalty clauses that would trigger if the meeting didn't happen by end of business Eastern Time. Every minute mattered. The fuel had been loaded the night before. Catering was confirmed. The jet had passed every inspection Liam could think of, plus 2 more he invented on his own. Everything was ready. Everything, except the one thing no one could control. At 7:15, Ray's phone rang. He answered it, listened for about 30 seconds, and then his face changed. He walked over to the maintenance bay where Liam was logging the tire pressure readings and set it flat. "Donovan's out. Woke up with chest pains. His wife took him to Sunrise Hospital an hour ago." Captain Greg Donovan was the primary pilot for all of Victoria Hale's executive flights. He was 51, experienced, and as of this morning, lying in a hospital bed with electrodes on his chest. Ray rubbed the back of his neck. "We've got 90 minutes to find a replacement, or this whole thing falls apart." The calls started immediately. 2 contract pilots in the area. One was already booked, the other didn't pick up. The backup list ran dry in 40 minutes. Ray worked the phone while the rest of the crew stood around the hangar in that specific kind of silence that happens when people know a storm is coming, but don't know from which direction. Liam stayed under the jet. He finished his checklist, initialed every line, and said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury for people who didn't have work to do. Victoria Hale's black sedan pulled onto the tarmac at exactly 8:05. She stepped out in a charcoal suit phone, already at her ear heels, clicking on the concrete like a metronome counting down. She was 43, built her first charter company at 29, and had spent the last 14 years turning it into one of the most profitable private aviation firms on the West Coast. She did not raise her voice often, but when she did, it reorganized the room. Today she was already loud before she cleared the car door. Ray intercepted her halfway across the hangar floor and delivered the news as carefully as he could. Victoria listened, her jaw tightening with every sentence. She asked how many alternates had been contacted. Ray told her. She asked about mutual aid agreements with other operators. Ray told her that too. Each answer made the next question sharper until she wasn't asking anymore. She was issuing verdicts. This is a $38 million contract, Ray. I don't need excuses. I need someone in that cockpit in the next 30 minutes, or every person in this hangar can start looking for new employment. The crew heard it. All of them. The fuel technician, the catering coordinator, the 2 ramp agents pretending to check tie-down straps. And Liam still beneath the Gulfstream with a flashlight and a torque wrench, finishing his final inspection, as though the world above him hadn't shifted. Victoria's gaze swept the hangar like a searchlight. It stopped on him. She walked toward the nose of the aircraft, her heels echoing in the sudden quiet. Liam slid out from under the fuselage on a creeper cart, looked up and saw her standing directly above him, oil on his hands, grease on his collar, a wrench resting across his chest like a seatbelt. He was the opposite of everything she represented. Title, visibility, authority. And in that moment, he became the target for everything she couldn't control. 6 years? Victoria said, her voice pitched for an audience. 6 years you've been out here crawling around my aircraft. You know every system, every rivet, every wire. That's what your file says. So if you know this jet so well, why don't you fly it? A few of the crew members exchanged glances. Someone near the back let out a short, nervous laugh. Victoria didn't blink. She leaned in closer, close enough for Liam to see the tension in her neck. I'm serious. You think you understand this machine? Prove it. Fly this jet, then we'll talk. It was a performance. Everyone in the hangar knew it. She wasn't offering him the controls. She was using him to vent, to demonstrate what happened when things fell apart, and no one in her orbit could fix it. Liam was the safest target. No rank, no voice, no leverage. The kind of man people look through on their way to someone more important. Liam set the wrench on the concrete floor. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. The laughter from earlier had already faded. Ray watched from near the office door, his clipboard lowered to his side, his expression caught between concern and recognition, like he was seeing something shift that he had quietly expected for years. The rest of the crew waited for the obvious response, a shrug, a step back, the usual surrender of a man who knew his place. Instead, Liam looked directly at Victoria Hale, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something far more unsettling. Calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from indifference, but from a decision that has already been made somewhere, deep and private. All right, he said. His voice was low, steady, almost too quiet for the space. I'll fly it. The hangar went still. Victoria's expression flickered. Loss of composure is perhaps too strong. It was more like a crack in a mask she didn't realize she was wearing. She had expected silence or shame. She had not expected agreement. Ray stepped forward. Liam, you don't have to do this. It was the closest thing to protection anyone in that building had ever offered him. Liam looked at Ray the way a man looks at an old friend, right before doing something that can't be taken back. Yeah, he said. I do. He turned toward the Gulfstream's forward stairs, still in his oil-stained coveralls, and began to climb. Behind him, no one moved. No one spoke. And for the first time in 6 years, every single person in that hangar was looking at Liam Carter. The cockpit of the Gulfstream G700 was cold. The air conditioning had been running since pre-flight prep, and the leather seats held that refrigerated stillness that makes everything feel preserved, untouched, waiting. Liam lowered himself into the left seat, the captain's seat, and for a moment, he just sat there. His hands rested on his knees, palms down, fingers still carrying traces of hydraulic fluid. The instrument panel stretched out in front of him, like a language he hadn't spoken aloud in years, but had never stopped dreaming in. Every gauge, every switch, Every digital readout on the integrated avionics suite was exactly where his memory said it would be. Not because he had studied this cockpit, because he had lived inside cockpits like it in another life, under a different name on a different roster. Down on the hangar floor, Victoria Hale stood with her arms crossed, watching the forward stairs, as though she expected Liam to come back down at any second. Ray Dawson was already on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to the FAA compliance liaison. The legal question was simple and brutal. A mechanic with no current commercial pilot certification could not legally operate a charter flight carrying passengers. It didn't matter what he knew, it didn't matter what he could do. If the paperwork didn't exist, the flight didn't exist. Ray covered the phone's microphone and called up to the cockpit door. "Liam, we've got a regulatory wall here. You can't carry passengers without a valid ATP certificate. This isn't about skill, it's federal law." Liam's voice came back down the stairs, calm and without hesitation. "Check my full name in the FAA registry. Liam James Carter. The certificate is current." Ray blinked. He turned to one of the operations staff near the office and told him to pull it up. The room shifted into a different kind of tension, not the chaos of a canceled flight, but the quiet friction of something that didn't fit the story everyone had agreed on. Victoria uncrossed her arms. She didn't say anything, but her eyes moved from the cockpit door to Ray and back again with the sharpness of someone recalculating. It took less than 4 minutes. The operations coordinator came back from the office with a printout and handed it to Ray without a word. Ray read it twice. Then he looked up at the cockpit the way a man looks at a locked door he just realized was never locked at all. Liam James Carter held a valid airline transport pilot certificate multi-engine land with type ratings that included the Gulfstream G650 and G700. The certificate had been maintained, renewed, updated medical current every single year for the past 6 years. Quietly, without anyone at this airstrip ever knowing. He had been legal to fly this jet the entire time he had been crawling underneath it. Victoria took the printout from Ray's hand. She read it once, folded it, and looked toward the cockpit with an expression that had lost its earlier edge. The mockery she had thrown at Liam 10 minutes ago was still hanging in the air like smoke, and now it was settling on her. She said nothing. That silence was louder than anything she had said all morning. Around the hangar, the crew exchanged glances. The fuel technician, the ramp agents, the catering coordinator, all of them quietly rearranging what they thought they knew about the man who had just wiped engine grease off his hands and sat down in the captain's chair. Ray climbed the stairs and entered the cockpit. He found Liam running the pre-flight sequence from memory, his fingers moving across the overhead panel with the kind of fluency that doesn't come from manuals. It comes from repetition. Thousands of hours of repetition. Ray stood in the cockpit doorway and watched for a full 30 seconds before speaking. "How long were you going to keep this quiet?" Liam didn't look up. He was configuring the flight management system entering the route to Teterboro. "Wasn't keeping it quiet," he said. "Just wasn't advertising it." Ray shook his head slowly, not in disapproval, but in the particular disbelief of a man who realizes he's been standing next to a stranger for 6 years. "Who the hell are you, Liam?" Liam's hands stopped moving. His eyes stayed on the instrument panel, but his focus was somewhere else. Somewhere behind him in a year, and a place he had spent a long time walking away from. "I'm the guy who's going to get this plane to New York on time," he said. "That's all that matters right now." It was a deflection, and they both knew it. But Ray had worked around enough men with locked doors behind their eyes to know when not to push. He nodded, once pulled the cockpit door shut behind him, and went back down to the hangar to manage a crew that no longer understood the chain of command. Marcus Webb, the co-pilot who had been assigned to support Donovan on the charter, arrived at 8:20. He was 34 lean and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never had to prove anything to anyone outside of a simulator. When Ray told him the situation, Webb looked at the cockpit stairs and then back at Ray, as if waiting for the correction. "The mechanic," he said flatly. Ray handed him the FAA printout. Webb read it, and his expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He climbed the stairs and took the right seat without greeting Liam. The tension between them was immediate, not hostile, but loaded. Webb ran his own checks in silence, and every few seconds, his eyes drifted left, watching Liam's hands measuring the precision of each input against his own expectations. At 8:42, 3 minutes ahead of the original schedule, Liam keyed the radio and requested taxi clearance. His voice on the frequency was different from the voice the crew knew on the ground. Not louder, not deeper, but stripped of something. The hesitation was gone. The deference was gone. What came through the radio was pure procedure, clean, and practiced the kind of communication that air traffic controllers hear from pilots with 10,000 hours and immediately trust. Webb noticed it. He adjusted his posture in the right seat, straightening slightly the way a man does when he realizes the person next to him outranks him in ways that don't show on a badge. The Gulfstream rolled out of the hangar and onto the taxiway under a sky that was just beginning to heat. Inside the hangar, the crew watched through the open doors. Victoria stood apart from them, near the nose of the space where the jet had been parked. Minutes ago, her phone lowered to her side for the first time all morning. She was watching the aircraft move with an expression that wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to confrontation, not with Liam, but with herself. She had chosen him as a target because he looked like the weakest person in the room. Now the weakest person in the room was taxiing her $38 million asset toward the runway with the steady hand of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Liam lined up on runway. 25 set the brakes and brought the engines to takeoff thrust. The Rolls-Royce Pearl 700 spooled up with a sound that filled the cockpit like a second heartbeat. Webb called out the speeds. V1, rotate. And Liam pulled back on the side stick with a motion so smooth it barely looked like motion at all. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. The desert dropped away beneath them, and the Gulfstream climbed into the morning sky at a rate and angle that told Webb everything he needed to know. This wasn't a mechanic who had memorized a checklist. This was a pilot. A real one. The kind that gets built, not trained. As they passed through 12,000 feet, Webb finally spoke. "Where did you fly before this?" Liam kept his eyes on the instruments, watching the autopilot engage and the aircraft settle into its climb profile. "Edwards," he said, and then added nothing. Edwards Air Force Base, the birthplace of American test aviation, where the fastest and most dangerous aircraft in the country are pushed past their limits by pilots, selected for one reason: they don't break under pressure. Webb let the words sit in the cockpit like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't ask a follow-up. He didn't need to. Back on the ground, Ray Dawson was already on the phone with the company's operations director, walking through the legal and logistical reality of what had just happened. But Victoria had moved to the office at the back of the hangar, and she had pulled Liam's personnel file, the full one, not the summary sheet that HR keeps on top. What she found beneath 6 years of maintenance logs and equipment certifications was a second life compressed into military service records and a separation document that told a story no one in this building had ever asked to hear. Liam Carter had been a major in the United States Air Force, assigned to the 461st Flight Test Squadron at Edwards. His flight record included experimental airframes, high-altitude profiles, and classified performance evaluations that were redacted in places, but still clear enough to read the shape of what lay underneath. And then there was the incident. 8 years ago, during a test flight of a next-generation tactical platform, the aircraft experienced a catastrophic flight control failure at 47,000 feet. The wingman ejected and survived. Liam stayed with the aircraft, attempted a manual recovery, and brought it down to 19,000 feet before the secondary systems failed completely. He ejected 11 seconds before impact. The aircraft was destroyed. The investigation cleared him of fault, but the Air Force grounded him for 9 months during the review, and when the grounding was lifted, Liam didn't go back. He resigned his commission, moved to Las Vegas, and took a job maintaining the same kind of machines he used to fly. The file didn't say why. It didn't need to. Victoria closed the folder and set it on the desk. She sat in the silence of that small office, surrounded by filing cabinets and coffee-stained scheduling boards. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt the specific weight of having been wrong. Not wrong about a number or a contract, but wrong about a person. She had looked at Liam Carter and seen a mechanic. She had looked at his coveralls and his silence and his oil-stained hands, and decided that was the whole story. She had used him as a prop in her own frustration, a tool to demonstrate her authority, and he had absorbed it the way he absorbed everything quietly, completely, without giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. And now he was at 39,000 feet, flying her jet with a precision she had never once asked about, because she had never once thought to ask. Somewhere over western Kansas at cruise altitude, Liam felt it. Not turbulence. The sky was clean. The ride smooth, the system's nominal. What he felt was internal. A pressure behind his sternum that had nothing to do with cabin altitude, and everything to do with the last time he had sat in a cockpit, at this speed, at this height, with this much silence around him. The memory didn't come as a flashback. It came as a sensation, the feeling of the stick going dead in his hand, the sudden absence of feedback, the moment when the machine stopped being a partner and became a coffin. His fingers tightened on the armrest. His breathing changed, not visibly, not enough for Webb to notice, but enough for Liam to know that the thing he had buried under 6 years of maintenance logs and quiet mornings and parent-teacher conferences was still alive, still waiting. He thought about Sophie, 12 years old, sitting in a classroom right now expecting him at 4 o'clock. He thought about the promise he had made to himself the day he left Edwards, that he would never again put himself in a position where his daughter might get a phone call instead of a father coming home. And here he was, 39,000 feet above the ground, breaking that promise, with both hands on the controls. The fear wasn't about the aircraft. The Gulfstream was stable, healthy, perfectly maintained. He had made sure of that himself. The fear was about what it meant to be here, to be back in this seat, to have chosen in front of everyone to become the man he had spent 6 years trying to disappear. Webb glanced at him. "You good?" Liam released his grip on the armrest. He looked at the horizon line on the primary flight display, steady, level, unwavering, and made a decision that had nothing to do with altitude or airspeed. "Yeah," he said, "I'm good." But the truth was more complicated than that, and somewhere in the quiet space between his answer and the hum of the engines, Liam Carter understood that this flight was going to cost him something. Whether it was worth the price was a question he wouldn't be able to answer until he was back on the ground. The Gulfstream touched down at Teterboro at 12:53 Eastern Time, 1 hour and 52 minutes ahead of the contract deadline. The landing was textbook firm, centered the kind of arrival that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Webb handled the ground communications, while Liam brought the aircraft to a full stop on the taxiway and waited for the marshaller. The investors deplaned without knowing that the man in the left seat had started his morning under the belly of the aircraft with a torque wrench. They shook hands with a flight attendant, climbed into a waiting car, and disappeared into the New Jersey afternoon to close a deal worth $38 million. None of them looked back at the cockpit. The return flight to Las Vegas was quiet. Webb flew the first half from the right seat, while Liam monitored, and they switched somewhere over Missouri without discussion. It was the kind of cooperation that doesn't require friendship, just mutual recognition. Webb had stopped measuring Liam against expectations. Somewhere between takeoff and landing, the co-pilot had simply accepted that the man next to him belonged in that seat, and everything else was a question for another day. When they began their descent into the desert, the sun was already dropping toward the western ridgeline, painting the sand in shades of copper. Liam brought the Gulfstream back into the hangar at 3:47 Pacific Time. He shut down the engines in sequence, completed the post-flight checklist with the same precision he had applied to every other phase of the day, and sat in the captain's seat for an extra moment after the last system powered down. The cockpit was silent again, not the cold, waiting silence of the morning, but something heavier. The silence of a man who has just reopened a door he sealed shut years ago, and doesn't yet know whether to walk through it or close it again. He unstrapped, stood, and descended the forward stairs into a hangar that felt entirely different from the one he had left. The crew was still there. All of them. Ray Dawson stood near the maintenance bay with his arms at his sides, watching Liam come down the steps, the way a man watches someone return from a place he wasn't sure they'd come back from. The fuel technician, the ramp agents, the catering coordinator. They had all stayed past their shifts, not because anyone told them to, because something had happened in this building that morning that none of them fully understood, and they needed to see how it ended. Victoria Hale was standing at the center of the hangar floor, exactly where she had stood when she issued her challenge 8 hours ago. But nothing else about her was the same. She had read the file. She had spent the hours while the jet was in the air sitting in that back office, turning pages that told a story she had never bothered to look for. A decorated test pilot who had stayed with a dying aircraft to protect people on the ground. A man who walked away from the sky, not because he failed, but because he had a daughter who needed a father, more than the Air Force needed another name on a roster. A man who chose to be invisible, not out of weakness, but out of a loyalty so private it didn't require anyone else to see it. And she had stood in front of him that morning and called him nothing. Victoria walked toward Liam as he reached the bottom of the stairs. The hangar was quiet enough to hear her heels on the concrete, and this time, the sound didn't carry authority. It carried weight. She stopped about 6 feet from him, close enough to speak, without raising her voice, far enough to give him the space she hadn't given him that morning. "I read your service record," she said. Her voice was steady but stripped of the performance it had carried earlier. "I know what happened at Edwards. I know what you did up there, and I know why you left." Liam said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides, still in the same oil-stained coveralls, and waited. Victoria looked at him directly, not through him. "I was wrong this morning, not just about whether you could fly about who you are. I made a judgment based on what I saw, and what I saw was what I wanted to see. Someone smaller than me. Someone I could use to make myself feel like I was still in control." She didn't soften the words. She didn't wrap them in qualifications or corporate language. She said them plainly in front of every person who had heard her say the opposite that morning. "I'd like to offer you a position as chief pilot of this operation. Full authority over flight operations, crew scheduling, aircraft selection. The role is yours if you want it." The crew shifted. Ray's eyebrows went up slightly. Webb, still standing at the top of the stairs, leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. The offer was significant, not just in title and salary, but in what it represented. It was a public correction. Victoria Hale didn't do those often, and everyone in the building knew it. This wasn't a promotion, it was an admission. Liam looked at her for a long time, not with the calm deflection he had used all day, and not with the quiet distance he had maintained for 6 years. This time, his expression held something closer to honesty. "I appreciate that," he said, "and I'll think about it. But I've got a condition, and it's not negotiable." Victoria waited. Liam reached into his coveralls pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen showed Sophie's text from that morning, the parent-teacher reminder at 4 o'clock. It was now 3:51. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 12. She's the reason I left Edwards, and she's the reason I've been out here under your jets for 6 years instead of flying them. Whatever role I take in this company, it works around her, not the other way around. I don't miss her school events. I don't take calls during dinner. And if there's ever a conflict between a flight schedule and being her father, I choose her. Every time. That's not a preference. That's the terms." He said it without defiance, without bitterness. He said it the way a man states a fact that has already been tested by the hardest years of his life and held. Victoria nodded once. Done. There was no negotiation, no counter, no clause. Just the word delivered with the brevity of someone who had finally learned that the most important agreements don't require a contract. She extended her hand. Liam took it, oil and all, and they shook once in front of a crew that was still learning how to see him. Ray walked over as Victoria stepped back. He stood next to Liam and looked at the Gulf Stream, its engines still ticking as they cooled the hangar lights, reflecting off the fuselage in long, clean lines. "You could have told me, you know," Ray said. "Any time in the last 6 years." Liam glanced at him. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" Ray thought about that. "No," he admitted. "Probably not." Liam almost smiled. "Then it didn't matter." Liam walked to the locker room at the side of the hangar, pulled off his coveralls, and changed into the jeans and plain shirt he wore to Sophie's school functions. He checked his phone 3:58. He could still make it. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the side door, the same hook he had used every day for 6 years, and stepped out into the late afternoon heat. The hangar stayed open behind him. Inside, the crew returned to their routines, refueling, cleaning, logging. Victoria remained for a few minutes longer, standing near the spot where she had humiliated a man that morning and been corrected by his silence. She picked up the printout of Liam's FAA certificate from where Ray had left it on the workbench. She folded it once and placed it in her jacket pocket. Not as evidence, as a reminder. The day didn't end with a $38 million contract, though the contract closed on time. It ended with a man driving a 12-year-old truck across the desert toward a middle school where a 12-year-old girl was waiting by the front entrance with a backpack too big for her frame. Liam pulled up, and Sophie climbed into the passenger seat, the way she always did, one hand on the dashboard, one foot barely reaching the running board. She looked at him and frowned. "You smell like jet fuel." Liam started the engine. "Long day." She buckled her seatbelt and pulled out a folded piece of paper from her backpack, a math test, 92% her name, written in careful block letters at the top. She held it up without a word. Liam looked at it, looked at her, and nodded once. "That's my girl." They pulled out of the parking lot and onto the 2-lane road that led back toward their side of town. The sun was almost gone, the sky streaked with the last of the day's light, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. The thing about Liam Carter was that he had never needed anyone to see him in order to know who he was. He had flown the fastest machines his country ever built, and he had walked away from all of it for the person sitting next to him. That was not weakness. That was the most deliberate kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, and doesn't need a cockpit at 39,000 feet to prove it exists. It just shows up every morning, coveralls on, wrench in hand, ready.